Hello MIS students, my name is Arash. Here in the MIS Student Success Center, my colleagues and I are going to make some short videos to help you with the courses that need some hands-on experience, including business application development and databases. In this very first video, I am going to try to help break the ice between you and programming by showing you how easy it is to develop an application. I always tell my students that the best way to learn anything is by trying to actually do it. While we are working, I will talk about the mindset that you guys need to acquire during this course as a programmer, and in the end, I will give you a secret tool or a secret weapon, if you will, that will make your programming life much easier. So make sure that you watch this video till its very end. Now let's talk about the simple application that we are going to develop together today. This application is supposed to get a first name, a last name, and join the two to generate the complete name. So we are talking about a user interface like this, where the user is supposed to enter a first name, a last name, and press a button to ask the application to generate the complete name for her. My suggestion is that whenever you are asked to create an application, think of it as a system, and remember that every system has a set of inputs and a set of outputs. The inputs are typically provided by the user, and then the system transforms those inputs to the outputs and returns those outputs to the user. Again, it's the user interface that gets the inputs from the user and also returns the outputs to her. So this form here is going to be the UI of the application that we are going to develop. Now let's go back to the system's definition. I said that a system gets some inputs and transforms them to some outputs. In this picture, these gears in the system transforms the inputs to the outputs. In programming, it's your business logic that plays the role of these gears, which is basically the code that you are going to write. Now in this class, you are going to both design the user interface and write the code. With this preamble, let's develop this simple application. So we are in the Visual Studio environment. Let's create a new project. I urge you to start exploring the Visual Studio environment. Now in any programming course, don't feel that everything that you can learn is mentioned in your textbooks, because it is virtually impossible to cover everything in a textbook. Textbooks are good in the sense that they set some boundaries that clarify the requirements that you guys need to fulfill for the class. But as I said, they shouldn't limit you at the same time. So try to enjoy exploring the environment, and you are going to find some interesting features. Here I pick Visual C#, Windows Desktop, and Windows Forms application. You see that we have already got a form in here, which we need. Now, this form has some properties that we can change. So I am looking for the Properties tab. Let's change the title of this form to something like Hello Programming World. And as you see, the change has been actually applied to the form. So what else do I need? I need two text boxes for the inputs with two labels. So let's drag and drop these guys from the toolbox. I drag two text boxes and two labels and align them as I like. So let's click on this label and change its text. I can do this again using the Properties tab. So click on your label, go to the Properties tab and change the text, and you see that the change is applied to your label. Let's repeat the same thing for the second label. Click on it, go to the Properties tab and change its text to what you like. And remember that right now we are designing the user interface or the UI of our application. So what else do we need? We need a button. So let's drag and drop that from our toolbox on the left. We need to change the title of this button. So again, click on it, go to the properties box, and let's call this button something like give me the full name. What else do I need? Remember that every system needs to have at least one output, and it is typically your user interface that delivers the output to the user. So let's drag and drop a label on the form, and let's click on it and change its text to something like full name will appear here. So far, we have been designing the user interface of our application. Now let's execute this application by clicking the Start button on the top or by pressing the F5 key, function key number 5 on your keyboard. Now, this is the form that your end user is going to work with. She is going to enter her first name in here, her last name, and she is going to press this button to get the complete name. So let's do that. So her first name is, let's say, Jane, last name Doe, and if I press this button, nothing happens. Why is that? To answer this question, let's remember the definition of a system again. A system will get some inputs, which in our case is the first name and the last name, and will transform those inputs to the output, which in our case is going to be the complete name. Remember that it's the business logic of your application that is going to take care of that transformation. So we need to write a program for that. Let's do that. Close this form or just stop the execution and go to your design again. This button is actually a control on my user interface, and every control has some events attached to it. Actually, a system works by responding to different triggering events. This is how those gears in the system actually move. So ask yourself, what is the most common event of a button? It is clicking that button, isn't it? The user clicks the button, and that will trigger the transformation that we were talking about. In your design page, if you select your button on the Properties tab, you can also find out about the events that are related to that specific control using this lightning button. So here, if I double click in here or just simply double click on my button, it will take me to that specific event in my code. Notice that it is mentioned button 1, click, which means that whatever you write in between these two brackets is going to be executed in case your end user presses that specific button. And that code that you are going to write in here is going to be basically part of the logic of your application. So ask yourself, what does the application need to do in here? In other words, what does the application need to do in case my end user presses this specific button? Well, it should join whatever the user has already entered in those text boxes and show it to the user. So let's do that. For that, let's first define some variables. So my first variable is going to be called first, as for the first name. The second variable is going to be called last, as for my last name. And I need another variable for the complete name, and I call it complete. Let's talk about variables for a minute. Again, ask yourself, why do we call these guys variables? Well, since they are called variable, they have to do something with the verb vary, meaning that they have to do something with change. This means that they can hold different values at different times. In other words, the values that a variable holds will vary, hence the word variable. With this string here, I just specify the type of this variable, meaning that it is going to hold a string of characters, which again can be different at different times. And remember, different users that are going to use your application have different names. However, and as you can see, with a few variables, we are going to be able to handle all those different names in the future within our application. So what do we do now? I am going to say that the variable first, which we have already defined in here, is going to equal whatever my user has entered in the first text box. So first equals text box 1 tab dot, and you see that Visual Studio is suggesting that you can pick text, so just press tab and semicolon. Likewise, I am going to say that my variable last is going to equal whatever my user has entered in the second text box. So I can pick my second text box here, so I just press tab and I press dot text, again tab, semicolon. Now is the time to make the transformation on our inputs. So we have received our inputs and we are going to transform them to our output and return that output to our user. So in this case, I am going to basically join these two variables. So let's do that. Let's say complete, which is this variable that I have defined in here, equals first, which is the user's first name, plus last, which is the user's last name. And you see that Visual Studio is suggesting that you can use this variable since you have already defined that. So just press tab and semicolon. Now, are we done? Of course not, because again, we need to deliver this output to the user. So let's go back to our design page and see this label in here, which is label 4, is going to deliver that output to our user. So again, go back to your code and we just need to say that label 4 dot text equals complete. Now let's execute our application by pressing this button or just F5. And let's test our application. So let's suppose that the user's first name is Jane, her last name is Doe, and let's press this button. You see that we are receiving Jane Doe. However, there is a small problem in here. There should be a space between the user's first name and last name, which is very easy to take care of. So let's stop the application, go back to your code, and we can easily take care of that by adding a single space in here with double quotation, a space, double quotation. Now let's run our application again. Again, Jane Doe, and you see that this time there is a space between her first name and her last name. Now let's suppose that another user is using our application with another name. So let's suppose that his first name is John, his last name is Smith, and now press the button. You see that we are receiving John Smith. And this has been made possible by the virtue of using variables, because remember, a variable can hold different values at different times. Now let's talk about the secret tool that I mentioned in the beginning of this video. While you are programming, there is no doubt that you will make two different types of mistakes: syntax errors and logic errors. Syntax errors are easy to resolve. For instance, if I change the variable name and run the program, the compiler is going to highlight the syntax error for me, and I can simply go back to my code and fix it and run my application again. But what if I make a mistake in my logic? Those are going to be more difficult to catch. Remember that the code that we just wrote together today was pretty short and simple. Hopefully one day you are going to write longer and more complicated programs like these. Now, the more complicated your code gets, the easier it is to make a logic error. For that matter, I want you to get used to debugging your applications by tracing your code during its execution from the get-go. So do me a favor, whenever you write any code, trace it during the execution and see how it flows. This will let you find the mistakes in your logic later in the more complicated programs that you are going to write. So let's see how this works. In your code, in the logic that you have coded for this event, click somewhere on this bar. You see that this line has got highlighted. You have just hit a breakpoint or a checkpoint in your code. Make sure that your application is going to be run in the debug mode. Now execute your application. Let's suppose that her first name is Jane again, last name Doe, and let's press this button. You see that Visual Studio is waiting for us at the breakpoint in here. From this breakpoint, we can execute our logic line by line to make sure that everything flows smoothly. To do that, press F11 or function key number 11 on your keyboard so that this line gets executed. Since this line has just got executed, if you hover your pointer on this variable, you can see what this variable is holding. So it holds Jane, which we expect, and you see that Visual Studio is waiting for you to give it the go-ahead to execute this line. So if I press F11 again, this line gets executed, and it has, so if I hover my mouse over this variable, you can see that last equals do, which we expect. So Visual Studio is waiting for us here. Let's give Visual Studio the go-ahead by pressing F11. So this line has just got executed. If I hover my mouse over complete, you can see that complete equals Jane Doe, which we expect. And now if I press F5, it will continue the execution till its end. And you see that we are receiving Jane Doe here as we have been expecting. Please save this application as we may expand on it in the future. Try to enjoy programming and stay tuned as we are going to come to you with more videos.